Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in today. This is the Bodega Cat Book Club Spiritual Edition. And today we're continuing our reading of Flow by Mihaly. I call him Mr. C. I don't know how to pronounce his last name. Anyways, this book was inspired by an animated film with the same name that I recently saw. And I'll leave the official website of that animated film in the description box below. I don't think they're associated with each other, but I thought it was just kind of interesting that they have the same name. So I thought I'd read the book. So here we are. Anyways, and this is chapter 6, and we'll be reading part 2. And there's certain areas that I've highlighted. That means that there is a footnote at the end of the book, at the back of the book, which we will be reading. So, okay. I'm going to move the camera in a little bit so you guys can see better. Oh, too much. If you have a book, you can follow with us with the book. Or if you don't have the book, you can follow with us here, whatever works for you. Okay, the play of words. How does one start mastering a symbolic system? It depends, of course, on what domain of thought one is interested in exploring. We have seen that the most ancient and perhaps basic set of rules governs the usage of words. And today, words still offer many opportunities to enter flow and at various levels of complexity. A somewhat trivial but nevertheless illuminating example concerns working crossword puzzles. Let's read that again. A somewhat trivial but nevertheless illuminating example concerns working crossword puzzles. There is much to be said in favor of this popular pastime, which in its best form resembles the ancient riddle contests. Boy, I'm still kind of sleepy today. Um, It is inexpensive and portable. Its challenges can be finely graduated so that both novices and experts can enjoy it. And its solution produces a sense of pleasing order that gives one a satisfying feeling of accomplishment. It provides opportunities to experience a mild state of flow to many people who are stranded in airport lounges, who travel on commuter trains, or who are simply whirling away Sunday mornings or whiling away on Sunday mornings. But if one is confined to simply solving crosswords, one remains dependent on external stimulus. The challenge provided by an expert in a Sunday supplement or puzzle magazine. To be really autonomous in this domain, a better alternative is to make up one's own crosswords. When there is no longer need, then there is no longer need for a pattern to be imposed from the outside. One is completely free. And the enjoyment is more profound. It is not very difficult to learn to write crossword puzzles. I know of a child of 8 who, after trying his hand at a few Sunday puzzles in the New York Times, began writing his own quite credible crosswords. Of course, as with any skill worth developing, this one too requires the one invest. This one too requires that one invest psychic energy in it at the beginning. Wow, excuse me for the slow start. I think I probably need more coffee or something. A more substantive potential use of words to enhance our lives is the lost art of conversation. Utilitarian ideologies in the past 2 centuries or so have convinced us that the main purpose of talking is to convey useful information. Thus, we now value terse communication that conveys practical knowledge and consider anything else a frivolous waste of time. As a result, people have become almost unable to talk to each other outside of narrow topics of immediate interest and specialization. Few of us can understand any longer the enthusiasm of Caliph Ali bin Ali, who wrote, "A subtle conversation, that is the Garden of Eden." This is a pity because it could be argued that the main function of conversation is not to get things accomplished, but to improve the quality of experience. Peter Berger and Thomas Luckman, the influential phenomenological sociologists, have written that our sense of the universe in which we live is held together by conversation. When I say to an acquaintance when I meet in the morning, "Nice day," I do not convey primarily meteorological information, which would be redundant anyway since he has the same data as I do, but achieve a great variety of other unvoiced goals. For instance, by addressing him, I recognize his existence and express my willingness to be friendly. Second, I affirm one of the basic rules for interaction in our culture, which holds that talking about the weather is a safe way to establish contact between people. Finally, by emphasizing that the weather is nice, I imply the shared value that niceness is a desirable attribute. So the offhand remark becomes a message that helps keep the content of my acquaintance's mind in its accustomed order. His answer, "Yeah, it's great, isn't it?" will help keep will help will help to keep order in mind. Without such constant restatements of the obvious, Berger and Luckman claim, people would soon begin to have doubts about the reality of the world in which they live. The obvious phrases we exchange with each other, the trivial talk dribbling from radio and TV sets, reassure us that everything is all right, that the usual conditions of existence prevail. And I think I miss a footnote in the back. It's about conversation. The argument about conversation helps maintain the symbolic universe is in Berger and Luckman, 1967. Okay. The pity is that so many conversations end right there. Yet, when words are well chosen, well arranged, they generate gratifying experiences for the listener. It is not for utilitarian reasons alone that breadth of vocabulary and verbal fluency are among the most important qualifications for success as a business executive. Talking well enriches every interaction, and it is a skill that can be learned by everyone. One way to teach children the potential of words is by starting to expose them to wordplay quite early. Puns and double meanings may be the lowest form of humor for sophisticated adults, but they provide children with a good training ground in the control of language. All one has to do is pay attention during a conversation with a child. And as soon as the opportunity presents itself, that is, whenever an innocent word or expression can be interpreted in an alternative way, one switches frames and pretends to understand the word in that different sense. The first time children realized that the expression "having grandma for dinner" could mean either as a guest or as a dish. Really? As a dish? I didn't know that. Well, I didn't grow up with a grandma, so I won't know that phrase. Interesting. It will be somewhat puzzling, as will a phrase like "a frog in the throat." In fact, breaking the ordered expectations about the meaning of words can be mildly traumatic at first, but in no time at all, children catch on and give as good as they are getting, learning to twist conversations into pretzels. By doing so, they learn how to enjoy controlling words as adults. They might help revive the lost art of conversation. A major creative use of language, already mentioned several times in earlier contexts, is poetry. Because verse enables the mind to perceive experiences in condensed and transformed form, it is ideal for giving shape to consciousness. Reading from a book of poems each night is to the mind as working out a nautilus is to the body, a way for staying in shape. It doesn't have to be great poetry, but at least not at first. And it is not necessary to read an entire poem. What's important is to find at least a line or verse that starts to sing. Sometimes even one word is enough to open a window or a new view of the world to start the mind on an inner journey. And again, there is no reason to stop at being a passive consumer. Everyone can learn with a little discipline and perseverance to order personal experience in verse. As Kenneth Koch, I think it's Koch, the New York poet and social reformer, isn't he also a rich guy? Oh, interesting. Has shown even ghetto children and semi-literate elderly women in retirement homes are able to write beautifully moving poetry if they are given a minimum of training. The Koch brothers. That's why it sounds familiar. Sorry, little squirrel there. There is no question that mastering this skill improves the quality of their lives. Not only do they enjoy the experience, but in the process, they considerably increase their self-esteem as well. Let's read about the poetry part. How poetry can be taught to ghetto children and to old people in retirement homes without formal education is beautifully told by Koch, 1970-1977. Writing prose provides similar benefits. Although it lacks the obvious order imposed by meter and rhyme, it is a more easily accessible skill. To write great prose, however, is probably just as difficult as writing great poetry. In today's world, we have come to neglect the habit of writing because so many other media of communication have taken its place. Telephones and tape recorders, computers and fax machines are more efficient in conveying news. If the only point to writing were to transmit information, then it would deserve to become obsolete. But the point of writing is to create information, not simply to pass it along. In the past, educated persons used journals and personal correspondence to put their experiences into words, which allowed them to reflect on what had happened during the day. The prodigiously detailed letters so many Victorians wrote are an example of how people created patterns of order out of the mainly random events impinging on their consciousness. The kind of material we write in diaries and letters does not exist before it is written down. It is the slow or organically growing process of thought involved in writing that lets the ideas emerge in the first place. Not so long ago, it was acceptable to be an amateur poet or essayist. There was one country, I think it was Norway. I could be wrong. But there's one country that elevates the poet to a really, really high esteem. Um, Anyways, I thought that was interesting. Nowadays, if one does not make some money, however pitifully little, out of writing, it's considered to be a waste of time. It is taken as downright shameful for a man past 20 to indulge in versification unless he receives a check to show for it. And unless one has great talent, it is indeed useless to write, hoping to achieve great profit or fame. But it is never a waste to write for intrinsic reasons. First of all, writing gives the mind a disciplined means of expression. It allows one to record events and experiences so that they can be easily recalled and relived in the future. It is a way to analyze and understand experiences, a self-communication that brings order to them. Many have commented lately about the fact that poets and playwrights as a group show unusually severe symptoms of depression and other affective disorders. Perhaps one reason they become full-time writers is that their consciousness is beset by entropy to an unusual degree. Writing becomes a therapy for shaping some order among the confusion of feelings. It is possible that the only way writers can experience flow is by creating worlds of words in which they can act with abandon, erasing from the mind the existence of a troubling reality. Like any other flow activity, however, writing that becomes addictive becomes dangerous. It forces the writer to commit himself to a limited range of experiences and forecloses other options for dealing with events. But when writing is used to control experience without letting it control the mind, it is a tool of infinite subtlety and rich rewards. Okay, here's a footnote about writing and depression. At least since the Romantic era, artists of all types have been held to be tortured or demonically impelled. There is reasonably good evidence that many modern artists and writers, in fact, show a variety of depressive and obsessive symptoms. See E.G. Alvarez, 1973, Bergman, 1988, Mr. C, 1988, and Matson, 1980. Recently, much has been written also about the relationship of manic depression and literary creativity. Andreessen, 1987, Richards et al., 1988. It is very likely, however, that this relationship between psychic entropy and artistic creativity is the result of scientific cultural expectations and of the awkward structure of the artistic role, rather than anything necessarily inherent in art or in creativity. In other words, if to survive as an artist in a given social environment, a person has to put up with insecurity, neglect, ridicule, and a lack of commonly shared expressive symbols, he or she is likely to show the psychic effects of these adverse conditions. Vasari in 1550 was one of the first to express concern that the personality of the young Italian artists of the time, already influenced by Mannerism, a precursor of Baroque and Romantic styles, displayed a certain element of savagery and madness, which made them appear strange and eccentric in a way that previous artists were not. Vasari, 1550, 1959, page 232. In earlier periods, such as the Thousand Years of Egyptian Civilization or the Middle Ages, artists were apparently quite pleasant and well adjusted. Hauser, 1951. And of course, there are several more recent examples of great artists like J.S. Bach, Goethe, Dickens, or Verdi that disprove the existence of a necessary link between creativity and neurosis. Befriending Cleo. As memory was the mother of culture, Cleo the Proclaimer was her eldest daughter. In Greek mythology, she was the patroness of history, responsible for keeping orderly accounts of past events. Although history lacks the clear rules that make other mental activities like logic, poetry, or mathematics so enjoyable, it has its own unambiguous structure, established by the irreversible sequence of events in time. Observing, recording, and preserving the memory of both the large and small events of life is one of the oldest and most satisfying ways to bring order to consciousness. In a sense, every individual is a historian of his or her own personal existence. Because of their emotional power, memories of childhood become crucial elements in determining the kind of adults we grow up to be and how our minds will function. Psychoanalysis is to a large extent an attempt to bring order to people's garbled histories of their childhood. This task of making sense of the past, again, becomes important in old age. Erik Erikson has held that the last stage of the human life cycle involves the task of achieving integrity. or bringing together what one has accomplished and what one has failed to accomplish in the course of one's life in a meaningful story that can be claimed as one's own. History, wrote Thomas Carlyle, is the essence of innumerable biographies. Remembering the past is not only instrumental in the creation or preservation of a personal identity, but it can also be a very enjoyable process. People keep diaries, save snapshots, make slides and home movies, and collect souvenirs and mementos to store in their houses. To build what is in effect a museum of the life of the family, even though a chance visitor might be unaware of most of the historical references. He might not know that the painting on the living room wall is important because it was bought by the owners during their honeymoon in Mexico, that the rug in the hall is valuable because it was a gift of a favorite grandmother, and that the scruffy sofa in the den is kept because it was where the children were fed when they were babies. Okay, here's a footnote about remembering the personal past. In part under the influence of Erickson's psychobiological accounts of their lives, of Hitler, Gorky, Luther, and Gandhi, 1950, 1958, 1969, a concern for personal narrative has become prominent in lifespan developmental psychology. C. Kohler, 1982, Freeman, 1989, Gergen and Gergen, 1983, 1984, McAdams, 1985, Robinson, 1988, Sarba, 1986, and Schaefer, 1980. This perspective claims that knowing how a person sees his or her own past is one of the best ways to predict what he or she will do in the future. And footnote, for every home a museum. Mr. C. and Colberg Halton, 1981, studied over 300 members of three generational families around Chicago who were asked in their homes to show interviewers their favorite objects and to explain the reasons for cherishing them. Oops. Having a record of the past can make a great contribution to the quality of life. It frees us from the tyranny of the present and makes it possible for consciousness to revisit former times. It makes it possible to select and preserve in memory events that are especially pleasant and meaningful, and so to create a past that will help us deal with the future. Of course, such a past might not be literally true, but then the past can never be literally true in memory. It must be continuously edited, and the question is only whether we take creative control of the editing or not. Most of us don't think of ourselves as having been amateur historians all along, but once we become aware that ordering events in time is a necessary part of being a conscious being, and moreover that it is several levels. Oh, sorry, skipping skipping a sentence or line here, that it is an enjoyable task, then we can do a much better job of it. There are several levels at which history as a flow activity can be practiced. In the most personal involves simply keeping a journal. The next is to write a family chronicle going as far into the past as possible, but there is no reason to stop there. Some people expand their interest to the ethnic group to which they belong and start collecting relevant books and memorabilia. With an extra effort, they can begin to record their own impressions of the past. Oh, sorry. Thus becoming a real amateur historians. Others develop an interest in the history of community in which they live, whether it is the neighborhood or the state, by reading books, visiting museums, and joining historical associations. Or they may focus on a particular aspect of that past. For instance, a friend who lives in the wilder reaches of Western Canada, has been fascinated by, quote, early industrial architecture in that part of the world, and has gradually learned enough about it to enjoy trips to out of the way sawmills, foundries, and decaying railway depots, where his knowledge enables him to evaluate and appreciate the fine points of what anyone else would dismiss as piles of weedy junk. I am so sorry. I'm having a hard time reading today. Weedy junk. All too often, we are inclined to view history as a dreary list of dates to memorize, a chronicle established by ancient scholars for their own amusement. It is a field we might tolerate but not love. It is a subject we learn about so as to be considered educated, but it will be learned unwillingly. If this is the case, history can do little to improve the quality of life. Knowledge that is seen to be controlled from the outside is required with reluctance, and it brings no joy. But as soon as a person decides which aspects of the past are compelling and decides to pursue them, focusing on the sources and the details that are personally meaningful and recording findings in a personal style, then learning history can become a full-fledged flow experience. The delights of science. After reading the preceding section, you may find it just barely plausible that anyone could become an amateur historian. But if we take the argument to another field, can we really conceive of a layperson's becoming an amateur scientist? After all, we have been told many times that in this century, science has become a highly institutionalized activity, with with the main action confined to the big leagues. It takes extravagantly equipped laboratories, huge budgets, and large teams of investigators to survive on the frontiers of biology, chemistry, or physics. Oh, sorry about that. A little sideways there. It is true that if the goal of science is to win Nobel Prizes or to attract the recognition of professional colleagues in a in the highly competitive arena of a given discipline, then the extremely specialized and expensive ways of doing science may be the only alternative. In fact, this highly capital intensive scenario, based on the model of the assembly line, happens to be an inaccurate description of what leads to success in quote professional science. It is not true, despite what the advocates of technocracy, um, technocracy would like us to believe, that breakthroughs in science arise exclusively from teams in which each researcher is trained in a very narrow field and where the most sophisticated state-of-the-art equipment is available to test out new ideas. Neither is it true that great discoveries are made only by centers with the highest levels of funding. These conditions may help in testing novel theories, but they are largely irrelevant to whether creative ideas will flourish. New discoveries still come to people as they did to Democritus sitting lost in thought in the market square of his city. They come to people who so enjoy playing with ideas that eventually they stray beyond the limits of what is known and find themselves exploring an uncharted territory. Even the pursuit of, quote, normal as opposed to, quote, revolutionary or creative, science would be next to impossible if it did not provide enjoyment to the scientist. In his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, Thomas Kuhn suggests several reasons why science is fascinating. First, by focusing attention upon a small range of relatively, uh, oops, sorry, esoteric problems, the paradigm or theoretical approach forces scientists to investigate some part of nature in a detail and depth that would otherwise be unimaginable. This concentration is made possible by, quote, rules that limit both the nature of acceptable solutions and the steps by which they are obtained, unquote. And Kuhn claims a scientist engaged in, quote, normal science is not motivated by the hope of transforming knowledge or finding truth or improving the conditions of life. Instead, quote, what then challenges him is the conviction that if only he is skillful enough, he will succeed in solving a puzzle that no one before has solved so well, unquote. He also states, quote, the fascination of the normal research paradigm is that though its outcome can be anticipated, the way to achieve that outcome remains very much in doubt. The man who succeeds proves himself an expert puzzle solver, and the challenge of the puzzle is an important part of what usually drives him on, unquote. It is no wonder that scientists often feel like P.A.M. Dirac, the physicist who described the development of quantum physics in 1920s by saying it was a game, a very interesting game one could play. Kuhn's description of the appeal of science clearly resembles reports describing why riddling or rock climbing or sailing or chess or any other flow activity is rewarding. If normal scientists are motivated in their work by the challenging intellectual puzzles they confront in their work, quote, revolutionary scientists, the ones who break away from existing theoretical paradigms to forge new ones, are even more driven by enjoyment. A lovely example concerns Subramanian Chandrasekhar. Sounds like Indian. Yeah, Calcutta, India. The astrophysicist whose life has already acquired mythical dimensions. He left India as a young man in 1933, on a slow boat from Calcutta to England. He wrote out a model of stellar evolution that with time became the basis of the theory of black holes. I think this is the guy that they made a movie of. I have to look for it, but if I find the movie, I'll put it in the description box below. A very interesting movie. I think that was with oh, the actor escapes me. Anyways, little squirrel there. Um, I don't know if it's the same guy. So, anyways, if I find it, I'll put it in the description. It's on YouTube. You could watch it for free. The movie, you could watch the movie for free. But his ideas were so strange that for a long time they were not accepted by the scientific community. He eventually was hired by the University of Chicago, where he continued his studies in relative obscurity. There is one anecdote told about him that best typifies his commitment to his work. In the 1950s, Chandrasekhar was staying in Williams Bay, Wisconsin, where the main astronomical observatory of the university is located, about 80 miles away from the main campus. That winter, he was scheduled to teach one advanced seminar in astrophysics. Only two students signed up for it, and Chandrasekhar was expected to cancel the seminar rather than go through the inconvenience of commuting. But he did not, and instead drove back to Chicago twice a week along backcountry roads to teach the class. A few years later, first one, then the other of those two former students won the Nobel Prize for Physics. Whenever this story used to be told, the narrator concluded with sympathetic regrets that it was a shame the professor himself never won the prize. That regret is no longer necessary because in 1983, Chandrasekhar himself was awarded the Nobel for Physics. It is often under such unassuming circumstances, with people dedicated to playing with ideas, that breakthroughs in the way we think occur. One of the most glamorous discoveries of the last few years involves the theory of superconductivity. Two of the protagonists, K. Alex Muller and J. George Bednortz, worked out the principles and the first experiments in the IBM laboratory in Zurich, Switzerland, not exactly a scientific backwater, but not one of its hotspots either. For several years, the researchers did not let anyone else in on their work, not because they were afraid it would be stolen, but because they were afraid that the colleagues would laugh at their seemingly crazy ideas. They received their Nobel Prizes for physics in 1987. Susumu Tonegawa, who that same year received the Nobel Prize for biology, was described by his wife as a going his own way kind of person. Quote, going his own way kind of person who likes sumo wrestling because it takes individual effort and not team performance to win in that sport, just as in his own work. Clearly, the necessity of sophisticated laboratories and enormous research teams has been somewhat exaggerated. Breakthroughs in science still depend primarily on the resources of a single mind. But we should not be concerned primarily with what happens in the professional world of scientists. Quote, big science can take care of itself, or at least it should, given all the support it has been given since the experiments with splitting the atomic nucleus turned out to be such a hit. What concerns us here is amateur science, the delight that ordinary people can take in observing and recording laws of natural phenomena. It is important to realize that for centuries, great scientists did their work as a hobby because they were fascinated with the methods they had invented rather than because they had jobs to do and a fat government grants to spend. Okay, let's read some of the footnotes here. Okay. The four quotations from Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, 1962, are from pages 24, 38, 38, and 36, respectively. One of the most exciting promises of flow theory is that it may help explain why certain ideas, practices, and products are adopted, while others are ignored or forgotten. Since at this point the histories of ideas, institutions, and cultures work almost exclusively within a paradigm informed by economic determinism. In addition, it might be revealing to consider how history is directed by the enjoyment of people derive or anticipate from different sources, from different courses of action. A beginning in that direction is Isabella, Mr. C's. I guess that won't be Mr. C, huh? I'll just say Isabella C. She might be a sister or a wife or cousin or whatever, right? Analysis of the reasons for the success of the Jesuit order of the 16th and century, 16th and century. I'm just having a hard time reading today. I don't know why. I feel like I have this frog in my throat. So my apologies. Thank you for sticking with me today. Okay, Jesuit order of the 16th and 17th centuries, 1988. Oh my goodness. All right, I'm gonna take a drink here for a minute. Maybe it's the weather. The weather's been really dry today. Yeah, blame it on the weather. Yeah, let's do that. Okay. Breakthroughs. It would go against the central message of this book to claim that the flow experience is, quote, good for you in the sense that it helps people achieve scientific or any other kind of success. It needs to be stressed again and again that what counts is the quality of experience flow provides, and that this is more important for achieving happiness than riches or fame. At the same time, it would be disingenuous to ignore the fact that successful people tend to enjoy what they do to an unusual extent. This may indicate that people who enjoy what they're doing will do a good job of it, although, as we know, correlation does not imply causation. A long time ago, Maurice Schlick in 1934 pointed out how important enjoyment was in sustaining scientific creativity. In an interesting recent study, B. Eugene Gressman interviewed a potpourri of high achievers ranging from Francis H.C. Crick to the co-discoverer of the double helix, to Hank Aaron, Julie Andrews, and Ted Turner. 15 of these celebrities completed a questionnaire in which they rated the importance of 33 personal characteristics, such as creativity, competence, and breadth of knowledge, in terms of helping them achieve success. The item most strongly endorsed for an average of 9.86 on a 10-point scale was enjoyment of work. Griezmann, 1987, page 294 and 295. Another indication of how flow may be linked to success is suggested by the work of Larson, 1985, 1988. In a study of high school juniors writing a month-long assignment, he found that the students who were bored wrote essays expert English teachers found boring. Students who were anxious wrote disconnected essays that were confusing to read, whereas students who enjoyed the writing task created essays that were enjoyable to read, this controlling for differences in intelligence or ability among the students. The obvious suggestion is that a person who experiences flow in an activity will end up with a product that others will find more valuable. The interview with the wife of Susumu Tonegawa appeared in USA Today, October 13, 1987, page 2A. Is the situation really that different these days? Is it really true that a person without a PhD who is not working at one of the major research centers no longer has any chance of contributing to the advancement of science? Or is this just one of those largely unconscious efforts at mystification to which all successful institutions inevitably succumb? It is difficult to answer these questions, partly because what constitutes science is, of course, defined by those very institutions that are in line to benefit from their monopoly. There is no doubt that a layman cannot contribute as a hobby to the kind of research that depends on multi-billion-dollar super colliders or on nuclear magnetic resonance spectroscopy. Oh boy. Okay, little tongue twister there. Spectroscopy. But then, such fields do not represent the only science there is. The mental framework that makes science enjoyable is accessible to everyone. It involves curiosity, careful observation, a disciplined way of recording events, and finding ways to tease out the underlying regularities in what one learns. It also requires the humility to be willing to learn from the results of past investigators, coupled with enough skepticism and openness of mind to reject beliefs that are not supported by facts. Okay. The amazing variety of things adults learn in their free time is described in the investigations of Alan Tuff, 1978. See also Gross, 1982. One of the areas of knowledge to which laypersons continue to contribute is that concerning health. One keeps hearing how people, often mothers, will notice some peculiarities in the health patterns of members of their family, which, when communicated to health experts, turn out to have beneficial consequences. For example, Burton Roche, 1988, reports how a woman in New England, struck by the fact that her son and many of his friends were suffering from arthritic pains in the knee, alerted doctors of this suspicious coincidence. And as a result of her information, researchers, quote, discovered Lyme disease, a potentially serious affliction transmitted by ticks. Defined in this broad sense, there are more practicing amateur amateur scientists than one would think. Some focus their interest on health and try to find out everything they can about a disease that threatens them or their families. Following in Mendel's footsteps, some learn whatever they can about breeding domestic animals or creating new hybrid flowers. Others diligently replicate the observations of early astronomers with their backyard telescopes. There are closet geologists who roam the wilderness in search of minerals, cactus collectors who scour the desert mesas for new specimens, and probably hundreds of thousands of individuals who have pushed their mechanical skills to the point that they're verging on true scientific understanding. What keeps many of these people from developing their skills further is the belief that they will never be able to become genuine, quote, professional scientists, and therefore that their hobby should not be taken seriously. But there is no better reason for doing science than the sense of order it brings to the mind of the seeker. If flow, rather than success and recognition, is the measure by which to judge its value, science can contribute immensely to the quality of life. Loving wisdom. Philosophy, quote, philosophy used to mean, quote, love of wisdom, and people devoted their lives to it for that reason. Nowadays, professional philosophers would be embarrassed to acknowledge so naive a conception of their craft. Today, a philosopher may be a specialist in deconstructionism or logical positivism, an expert in early Kant or late Hegel, an epistemolog sorry, epistemolog oh, sorry. Okay, let's try it again. Oh my goodness. Epistemologist. Oh my goodness. I'll take a sip of my tea here. Epistemologist or an existentialist, but don't bother him with wisdom. It is a common fate of many human institutions to begin as a response to some universal problem until, after many generations, the problem peculiar to the institutions themselves will take precedence over the original goal. For example, modern nations create armed forces as a defense against enemies. Soon, however, an army develops its own needs, its own politics, to the point that the most successful soldier is not necessarily the one who defends the country best, but the one who obtains the most money for the army. Amateur philosophers, unlike their professional counterparts at universities, need not worry about historical struggles for prominence among competing schools, the politics of journals, and the personal jealousies of scholars. They can keep their minds on the basic questions. What these are is the first task for the amateur philosopher to decide. Is he interested in what the best thinkers of the past have believed about what it means to, quote, be? Or is he more interested in what constitutes the, quote, good or the, quote, beautiful? As in all other branches of learning, the first step after deciding what area one wants to pursue is to learn what others have thought about the matter. By reading, talking, and listening selectively, one can form an idea of what the quote state of the art in a field is. Again, the importance of personally taking control of the direction of learning from the very first steps cannot be stressed enough. If a person feels coerced to read a certain book, to follow a given course because that is supposed to be the way to do it, learning will go against the grain. But if the decision is to take that same route because of an inner feeling of rightness, the learning will be relatively effortless and enjoyable. When his predilections in philosophy become clear, even the amateur may feel compelled to specialize. Someone interested in the basic characteristics of reality may drift toward ontology and read Wolff, Kant, Husserl, and Heidegger. Another person more puzzled by questions of right and wrong would take up ethics and learn about moral philosophy of Aristotle, Aquinas, Spinoza, and Nietzsche. An interest in what is beautiful may lead to reviewing the ideas of aesthetic philosophers like Baumgarten, Croce, Croce, mm, Croce, Santayana, and Collingwood. While specialization is necessary to develop the complexity of any pattern of thought, the goals-ends relationship must always be kept clear. Specialization is for the sake of thinking better and not an end in itself. Unfortunately, many serious thinkers devote all their mental efforts to becoming well-known scholars, but in the meantime, they forget their initial purpose in scholarship. In philosophy, as in other disciplines, there comes a point where a person is ready to pass from the status of passive consumer to that of active producer. To write down one's insights, expecting that someday they will be read with awe by posterity, would be in most cases an act of hubris, that quote overweening presumption that has caused so much mischief in human affairs. But if one records ideas in response to an inner challenge to express clearly the major questions by which one feels confronted and tries to sketch out answers that will help make sense of one's experiences, then the amateur philosopher will have learned to derive enjoyment from one of the most difficult and rewarding tasks of life. Amateurs and professionals. Some individuals prefer to specialize and devote all their energy to one activity, aiming to reach almost professional levels of performance in it. They tend to look down on anyone who is not as skillful and devoted to their specialty as they themselves are. Others prefer to dabble in a variety of activities, taking as much enjoyment as possible from each without necessarily becoming an expert in any one. There are two words whose meanings reflect our somewhat warped attitudes toward levels of commitment to physical or mental activities. These are the terms amateur and dilettante. Nowadays, these labels are slightly derogatory. An amateur or a dilettante is someone not quite up to par, a person not to be taken very seriously, one whose performance falls short of professional standards. But originally, quote, amateur from the Latin verb amare, quote, to love, referred to a person who loved what he was doing. Similarly, a quote dilettante from the Latin delectare, quote, to find delight in, was a person who enjoyed a given activity. The earliest meanings of these words, therefore, drew attention to experiences rather than accomplishments. They described the subjective rewards individuals gain from doing things instead of focusing on how well they were achieving. Nothing illustrates as clearly our changing attitudes toward the value of experience as the fate of these two words. There was a time when it was admirable to be an amateur poet or a dilettante scientist because it meant that the quality of life could be improved by engaging in such activities. But increasingly, the emphasis has been to value behavior over subjective states. What is admired is success, achievement, the quality of performance, rather than the quality of experience. Consequently, it has become embarrassing to be called a dilettante, even though to be a dilettante is to achieve what counts most, the enjoyment one's actions provide. It is true that the sort of dilettantish or learning encouraged here can be undermined even more readily than professional scholarship if the learners lose sight of the goal that motivates them. Excuse me. Mm. Laypersons with an axe to grind sometimes turn to pseudoscience to advance their interests, and often their efforts are almost indistinguishable from those of intrinsically motivated amateurs. An interest in the history of ethnic origins, for instance, can become easily perverted into a search for proofs of one's own superiority over members of other groups. The Nazi movement in Germany turned to anthropology, history, anatomy, language, biology, and philosophy and concocted from them its theory of Aryan racial supremacy. Professional scholars were also caught up in this dubious enterprise, but it was inspired by amateurs, and the rules by which it was played belonged to politics, not science. Soviet biology was set back a generation when the authorities decided to apply the rules of communist ideology to growing corn instead of following experimental evidence. Lysenko's ideas about how grains planted in a cold climate would grow more hardy and produce even hardier progeny sounded good to the layperson, especially within the context of Leninist dogma. Unfortunately, the ways of politics and the ways of corn are not always the same. And Lysenko's efforts culminated in decades of hunger. How sad. The bad connotations that the terms amateur and dilettante have earned for themselves over the years are due largely to the blurring of the distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic goals. An amateur who pretends to know as much as professional is probably wrong and up to some mischief. The point of becoming an amateur scientist is not to compete with professionals on their own turf, but to use a symbolic discipline to extend mental skills, to create order in consciousness. On that level, amateur scholarship can hold its own and can be even more effective than its professional counterpart. But the moment that amateurs lose sight of this goal and use knowledge mainly to bolster their egos or to achieve a material advantage, then they become caricatures of the scholar. Without training in the discipline of skepticism and reciprocal criticism that underlies the scientific method, laypersons who venture into the fields of knowledge with prejudiced goals can become more ruthless, more gregariously unconcerned with truth, and even the most corrupt scholar. The challenge of lifelong learning. The aim of this chapter has been to review the ways in which mental activity can produce enjoyment. We have seen that the mind offers at least as many and as intense opportunities for action as does the body. Just as the use of the limbs and of the senses is available to everyone without regard to sex, race, education, or social class, so too the uses of memory, of language, of logic, and of the rules of causation are also accessible to anyone who desires to take control of the mind. Many people give up on learning after they leave school because 13 or 20 years of extrinsically motivated education is still a source of unpleasant memories. Their attention has been manipulated long enough from the outside by textbooks and teachers, and they have counted graduation as the first day of freedom. But a person who foregoes the use of his symbolic skills is never really free. His thinking will be directed by the opinions of his neighbors, by the editorials in the papers, and by the appeals of television. He will be at the mercy of, quote, experts. Ideally, the end of extrinsically applied education should be the start of an education that is motivated intrinsically. At that point, intrinsically. At that point, the goal of studying is no longer to make the grade, earn a diploma, or find a good job. Rather, it is to understand what is happening around one, to develop a personally meaningful sense of what one's experience is all about, and also to promote critical thinking, which is something that's lacking in today's institutional education, right? Excuse me. From that will come the profound joy of the thinker, like that experienced by the disciples of Socrates that Plato describes in Philebus. Quote, the young person who has drunk for the first time from that spring is as happy as if he had found a treasure of wisdom. He is positively enraptured, sorry. He will pick up any discourse, draw all its ideas together to make them into one, then take them apart and pull them to pieces. He will puzzle first himself, then also others, badger whoever comes near him, young and old, sparing not even his parents, not anyone who is willing to listen. End quote. The quotation is about 24 centuries old. But a contemporary observer could not describe more vividly what happens when a person first discovers the flow of the mind. I think I missed uh, footnotes back there, so let's finish that. Um, okay, I think we'll start here. The amazing variety of things adults learn. Oh, I think I read that. Yeah, this is the mom that discovered the Lyme disease, right? Did I read that back here? I don't remember now. Mm, I'm a little altered today, consciously altered. Not quite here today. Trying to see if I read about that. I think I read that. That sounds familiar. Yeah, I think I read that. Okay. So then the next footnote would be the philosophers. It may be presumptuous to present a quote reading list of the great philosophers, but to simply name them without a reference would also offend professional scruples. So here goes. A few of the most seminal works in each area might include the following. As to ontology, there are Christian von Wolff's Verentige Gedanken, Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, Husserl's Ideas General Introduction to Pure Phenomenology, and Heidegger's Being in Time, 1962. For these last two, it might be a good idea to start with the introductions to Husserl by Kohat, 1978, and by Kolakowski, 1987, and to Heidegger by George Steiner, 1978, 1987. In terms of ethics, one would certainly wish to tackle Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, Aquinas' treatises on human acts, on habits, and on the active and contemplative life in the Summa Theologica, Benedict Spinoza's Ethics, and from Nietzsche, Beyond Good and Evil, and Genealogy of Morals. In aesthetics, Alexander Baumgarten's Reflections on Poetry, Benedetto Croce's Aesthetics, Santayana's The Sense of Beauty, and Collingwood's The Principles of Art. The 54-volume series of the Great Books of the Western World, now edited by Mortimer Adler and published by the Encyclopedia Britannica, is a good introduction to the most influential thinkers of our culture. The first two Syntopicon volumes, which contain a summary of the main ideas of the books that follow, would be especially useful to the amateur philosopher. And then a footnote on Lysenko, Medvedev, 1971, provides an informed account of how the agricultural policies of Lysenko, based on Leninist dogma, resulted in food shortages at Soviet Russia. See also Lecourt, 1977. Well, and that concludes chapter 6. That was a long chapter. I hope you enjoyed that. Anyways, we will continue our reading next week, and hopefully my voice is a little better and I can read a little smoother. Otherwise, I hope you guys all have a great day. All right, bye-bye now.